From time to time, in certain countries in the world, conditions exist which allow us to see human attributes which are common to us all in a new and different way. Brazil is such a country. These modern apartment buildings on the seafront are at one end of a social spectrum which includes both the wealthy, educated and powerful and the unschooled poor. The attribute in question is the human ability to calculate and compute. Street trading in Brazil involves more people and is a much more visible activity than the equivalent methods of retailing in the West. Every day is market day in Recife, and in the crowded streets there are many people whose families have left upcountry villages to find work in the city. The physical labour, which is becoming a rare sight in the industrial West, is commonplace here, and it involves children as well as adults. Keeping up with Brazil's inflation rate of 10% per month means work and more work. Buying and selling is a common resort for all. Many children work as street traders from an early age. They help on their parents' stalls or trade on their own. They know very little school maths, but because they use money all the time, they develop their own ways of doing calculations and of contending with its changing value. The unit of currency in Brazil is the new cruzado, which is equivalent to 1,000 old cruzados. Street traders use both as they count and compute. The life of the streets and the mathematical abilities it displays has begun to attract the attention of psychologists like Ana Lucia, who specializes in finding out from the child workers how they do their sums. These boys make small but significant amounts of money each day by minding parked cars. They go to school for a few hours in the evenings. But it's the maths they do in their heads which interests Ana Lucia.
Marcelo, se você tivesse 10 cruzados, é muito dinheiro, né? E aí você pegasse 10 cruzados mesmo, né? Daqui a 10 mil. Aí você fosse comprar uma coisa que custasse 1.700. Você tinha 10 mil cruzados, vai comprar uma coisa que custa 1.700. Você ainda fica com quanto dinheiro guardado? 8.300. 8.300. Como é que você fez essa conta? Dá para explicar?
Cabeça.
Como é que você faz de cabeça?
We all know here in Brazil that kids start to work in the streets selling things since they are only 8 years old. And they are very good at their maths when they are working. They have to give change, they have to find out the price of things and to add up, to subtract. And we decided to see how is it that they are doing those mathematical tasks outside of schools. And what we found was that they have very interesting strategies, always very meaningful, and at the same time, if we ask them to do school maths, they would try to use what the teacher has been trying to teach them, but in a very automatic, mechanical way, completely devoid of meaning.
Essa conta.
Marcelo is a case in point. His oral maths is good.
2.500 e 3.500. Dá 6, né? Aí se eu pagasse uma coisa que custasse 6 cruzados com uma nota de 10, qual era o meu troco? 4, né? Você, às vezes,
The
compra...
conversation switches easily between the new and old currencies. The next bit's in old cruzados.
Biscoito. Quanto é o biscoito? 500... O que é? Uma caixinha?
Não,
Um pacote. Um pacote? Se você comprar 7 pacotes de biscoito, vai ser quanto? Fala alto como é que você está fazendo essa conta. 3.500, tá certo.
So Marcelo can do sums in his head and get the right answer. But if he's asked to do them on paper, it's a different story. The sum is 10,000 minus 1,700.
No papel, essa conta assim.
10.000 menos 1.700. Como é que você fazia? Bote aí, 10.000 menos 1.700. Quanto é que dá?
When Marcelo tries to write the sum down in the school way, he doesn't include all the noughts, and he can't make the sum make sense. He scribbles an answer, but he knows it's wrong.
Quanto é que deu?
Deu 2. Não, tá errado.
Tá errado? Por que tá errado? Quanto é que devia dar certo? Qual é a resposta certa? 10.000.
He knows the answer in his head.
8.300.
Aham. E agora, vê se você consegue fazer certo. Levanta um pouquinho a cabeça, Marcelo. 10.000 menos 1.700, né?
But once again, it doesn't work out. Although Marcelo goes to school and knows how to write numbers, he can't do school sums. Street kids use street strategies.
One thing they do, if they had to add up numbers, they would decompose the numbers into bits and then would put them together again. This can only be done if you understand the additive composition of numbers, which is why we can, at school, perform those algorithms in which you have to carry the one, you have to borrow when you do subtractions.
Decomposing a number means splitting it up into convenient bits. Street traders have to work fast and be accurate. Once numbers are decomposed, they can be added or subtracted in parts. And because the larger parts are usually dealt with first, the hundreds say, rather than the tens or units, a good idea of the magnitude of the answer is established from the beginning. In the grounds of the university where she works, Ana Lucia's found a subject who spends his morning minding the cars of the university staff. Moises is 14. Although he does go to school, he's still only in the 4th grade, where you might expect a 10-year-old to be. He uses decomposition.
Foi 150.
Certo, como é que você achou?
Porque eu fiz assim, 500 com 200, 700. 80 com 70, 150. 850.
Certo. Aí, se você fosse pagar para uma pessoa 850 com uma nota de 1.000, qual era o seu troco?
150.
E como é que você sabe?
Porque 850 com 50, 900. Com 100, 1.000.
Ótimo. Agora vamos ver essa coisa.
Then Moises is asked to do the same sums on paper, in the way he's been taught at school.
580 com 270.
Com 270.
Quanto é que vai dar isso? Faça como faz na escola.
He gets this one right. Then comes the subtraction.
Menos 850. Conta de menos.
1.000.
1.000.
É 3 0, não deu?
É. E você vai tirar desse 1.850.
850.
Moises comes to grief here on what's known in the literature as a pedagogical obstacle. He's been taught that you can't take a big number from a smaller one, the 8 from the 1 in the lower sum. So he does it the other way round, taking the 1 from the 8, getting what he knows is the wrong answer.
Por que deu errado? Como foi que você fez?
Porque eu fiz assim, 0, 0. 5 para 0, 5.
It's as if the sum on paper has a life of its own, which he can't control, unlike the oral maths of the streets.
They just change ways of adding. They don't do it all in the same direction. They change numbers. They put one after the other. They put just one bit, and then the other bit comes later at the very end of the computation. That shows that they understand the basic logic. Why is it then that they fail at school? Probably because the activities are given at school completely devoid of meaning.
Vai ser o conjunto vazio.
Marcelo's school is several miles from the street where he works.
Igual e diferente.
The class is studying sets,
Fala do conjunto igual,
equal, empty, different, and unitary sets.
diferente e unitário. O conjunto diferente e igual tem 2 sinais. Os sinais de igual e o sinal de diferente. Então veja bem o seguinte. Vocês poderiam me responder que conjunto é esse? Vazio. Igual. Diferente. Podem
podem escrever.
State schools in Brazil often work on a shift system, with up to 3 different lots of children coming for their schooling at different times. This is the evening shift, and children don't move up the grades automatically. The teacher will hold them back if they haven't learnt enough in a year. So it's common to find different-aged children in the same group, and many children leave school having spent all their time in 3 or 4 lower grades. It was failure at school which caused the psychologists to begin their work in the first place.
We were very concerned about school failure. The first hypothesis we had was a very traditional one. Delays in cognitive development would explain the school failure. So we set up a study to compare poor kids in the state school system with richer ones in the private schools. Those kids had the same amount of school experience in mathematics, and we compared their cognitive abilities. To our amazement, at the end of the study, they had the same levels of development.
Having proved that the children in the state schools weren't backward, the psychologists began to look at the maths they found hard at school and to compare it with the maths of the streets. They found school maths to be full of routines and rules which, although they cohere into a system if the pupil sticks at the subject long enough, are in themselves often meaningless, consisting of adages like borrowing the 1 and shifting the decimal point, or of tautologies like the definition of an empty set.
Então, conjunto vazio, ele não contém nenhum elemento.
Of course, an empty set would contain no elements. That's what empty usually means.
Conjunto igual é dois conjuntos que têm quantidades.
The critique of school maths that's implicit in this kind of observation applies outside Brazil too.
Para poder ver a diferença de elementos.
By contrast, street life and the world of experience it offers continually provides both context and meaning for the calculations that are carried out in it. These traders not only deal with day-to-day inflation, which changes the sums they have to do so that they can't be memorized, but also, at the particular moment we were there, with a currency that consisted of both old and new cruzados, together with the remnants of an even earlier currency called the cruzeiro. And if their dealings related to foreign exchange, with an official and semi-official exchange rate which differed by a factor of 3. None of this seemed to confuse anybody, and business went on as usual. This stall is run by 18-year-old Antonio.
Olha, eu vou querer comprar guaraná, 2 bolos e 2 pedaços de galinha. Quanto é que vai ser tudo?
1,65.
Como é que você sabe que é 1,65? Tá certa essa conta? Me explica.
In this sum, Antonio holds over 50 cruzados, putting it on at the end.
Boto 250, pego os 800, aí faz 1.000. Aí eu pego os 600 do bolo e deixo 50 por fim.
Certo. Agora eu vou te pagar com uma nota de 5 cruzados. Quanto é que vai ser de troco?
3,35.
Uhum. E aí, como é que você encontrou esse resultado? Esse daí foi difícil, não foi?
É assim, 3,35, aí faz 2, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5.
6.
But while Antonio can do the sums for sales of different quantities of Coca-Cola, pieces of chicken and cakes in his head, on paper he is incompetent.
Vamos somar aí 250 mais 800 e mais 600. Agora você vai fazer essa soma pra mim, tá? Por escrito? Vê se você sabe fazer. Sabe não? Na cabeça como é?
Na cabeça?
Sim.
1,65.
1,65. E aí, vamos ver se a gente sabe. Como é que a professora manda fazer? 0 com 0, quanto é que dá?
0, 0.
Não.
Adding nothing to nothing is a fundamentally peculiar activity, but it's typical of much that's asked of children at school. Despite the vigorous chanting, which is a characteristic of many Brazilian lessons, competence in oral maths is not a great help to children at school. Street experts can even appear to be ignorant of number and logic. The requirements of the subject are always for what has previously been learnt at school, and never for what they knew before they started. The differences between oral and written maths, which are beginning to be so well understood, seem to indicate both a kind of blind spot on the part of some teachers to the competence of the children whose talents they're supposed to be developing, and also, perhaps, to some basic difference between the two approaches, which makes a transfer difficult.
Teachers tend to think that street kids, they are no good, that they are not clever enough to learn math. When we started doing those studies, whenever we went to a school, we would hear teachers saying, "Oh, is it about math? Don't do it because they are no good in math." We have been working hard to change this attitude, showing them the results we have. And probably now, when we enter many of the schools around here, we want to hear this expression anymore. They will tend to say, no, they are having difficulties, but they will get there, because we have already seen that they understand something.
Part of the fascination of street maths is its direct approach to the task in hand. Juan is 19. This is a housing project, an improved favela, with drains and running water. Juan lives here with his mother, in a little house with 2 rooms. A couple of years ago, he was a decomposer, like Moises and Antonia, and it is sums in his head. But then, Ana Lucia and her colleagues got hold of him and asked him several hundred questions. His response was to invent a notation system which made the task easier. It's decomposition in writing.
Eu quero que você faça a conta, ó. 28.
The sum is 28 plus 17.
20. Agora vai abrir 8. 10. Agora vai abrir o 7. Passar um tracinho. 20 mais 10, 30. 5, 5, 10. 3 mais 2, 5. Tracinho.
Certo.
30 mais 10. 40, 45.
Ótimo. Você ainda usa o mesmo jeito de fazer?
Juan now knows how to do this sort of calculation the school way. But many adults use the strategies they learnt as children all their lives, only developing new strategies as their work requires. The fisherfolk of this coast can multiply and divide and do proportions, as well as adding, subtracting, and counting change.
It's not only street kids who are doing street maths. We found adults who had never been to school doing very complicated maths in their work. For instance, carpenters, they have to compute the volume of wood or the price of wood. Fishermen, they use proportions every time. Lottery bookies, they have to deal with permutation at work. Construction foremen, they have to find out the size of walls from the measures in a blueprint. All these activities involve very complicated mathematics, and those people learn it independently from school experience, at work, in very meaningful ways.
A ostra, tu viu agora? Pegou agora no mar?
Pegou.
Pegou?
E agora? Não sei que eu não tirei, eu compro ela.
Foi você que tirou?
Foi, tava boa.
Deu pra pegar muita?
Não deu muito não, porque a maré foi imprensada, mas deu pra pegar.
Tem grande e pequena?
Tem grande e pequena.
A quanto está a grande?
These women sell the oysters they've gathered for 200 cents each if they're big, and 150 if they're small. Ana Lucia wants to buy 5.
Se eu levar 5 ostras de 150, quanto é que vai ser?
5 ostras de 150 dá 750.
Como é que você faz essa conta para saber que é 750?
Porque 5 a 100 é 500, né? Aí fica 5 vezes 5 para dividir, para dar 250. Aí,
Certo.
em 500 faz 750.
Escuta, tem uma pessoa ali que estava vendendo 5 ostras por 1.500. Estava por quanto cada ostra dela?
A 300.
Eita, como é que você já sabia? A resposta é tão
Porque a gente
depressa.
vende. Aqui eu vendo no Forte também. A 300, porque a 300, 5 ostras, dá 3, 3, 6, 3, 9, 300, 315.
Certo, muito bom. Uhum.
Você, a 300.
Quais são?
Some of the fish that's caught is dried or roasted before it's sold, and the proportion of dry weight can be estimated from the estimated weight of the catch.
E o camarão? É boa qualidade esse camarão? Ele é bom para comer fresco ou torrado?
Ele é bom para comer torrado.
Aí tem quantos quilos?
Aí tem 7.
7. Torrado, vai quebrar, vai ficar quanto?
5.
Fica 5 só? Uhum. Se eu quisesse levar 15 quilos de camarão torrado, quantos o senhor vai ter que pescar? 21?
21.
Como é que o senhor faz para saber que é 21?
O trabalho da gente que pega 21, ele tem de quebrar. O rádio tem que quebrar.
Tem que quebrar.
Lá pegando 21 pessoas assim, só dá 21 mesmo.
Assim só dá 21. Aí quando torrar, vai dar?
Tem que quebrar.
Tem que quebrar. Uhum. Certo.
So, what's the message from Brazil? Part of it is simply that, like the good natural scientists they are, the Brazilian psychologists are describing newly discovered natural phenomena, giving detailed accounts of how people think their way through sums. But there's another part too, what it's doing for maths as it's experienced by children at school.
Sim, a gente tá com a fichinha de 6, botar na mesinha.
What the Brazilian psychologists suggest is that the pre-literate children coming to school already have notions of number and logic which teachers should respect, and which should be taken into account in the kind of lessons which are presented.
Vamos contar de 10 em 10.
And that's just as much a necessity for British children in British schools as it is for the children of Brazil.
Se você quiser me dar 40, você
We have been suggesting to certain groups of teachers to try tasks that are, for instance, related to money transactions. That's something that every kid in Brazil have a very early experience, and that could bring meaning to quantities they have to deal with in school.
Vamos contar para esse 40. 10, 20, 30, 40. 40 é o quê? Cruzados novos.
Meaning is something that has to be brought into schools. If teachers could find ways of teaching those algorithms, but relating to the meaning the child already knows because they are doing this outside, that would be the perfect way to bridge the gap between street maths and school maths. Another thing is that the teacher's attitudes could also be changed because then they would see at first that the child already understands. It's now a matter of representing their understanding in a different way, in a different situation.
Vamos contar de novo. Quanto é que vale essa ficha? 10. Então a gente tem que contar de 10 em 10. Vamos contar, Clara? 10, 20, 30. Quanto é que vale uma ficha vermelha? 10. Então a gente vai contar de 10 em 10. Então quantas fichinhas vermelhas assim nós temos?